My friends, okay, now I got to hit that. Got it. My friends, this is Mason Winfield of Spirit Way Project in late October 2023. We're not quite ready to launch our regular schedule of podcasts, but we couldn't let Halloween go by without a serious conversation with a very impressive young friend of mine. I want to introduce to you Owen O Su, who is an inspiring young speaker, a poet, a composer, a musician. He's carrying on the spirit of the Gaelic bards, the spirit of the Gael, and yet everything about him is contemporary and reaches the living. I'd like to introduce Owen. Are you there?
Mason, here loud and clear. So great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, and for the extraordinary listeners I know that will be gathered around you and your work and Spirit Way's work. It's wonderful to be here.
Tell us just a little bit about you.
A little bit. Well, when you ask an Irishman for a little bit, you know, it's like torture, Mason. But I'm from an old family of both of my parents, my mother and my father, are great artists. And carrying on this Celtic lineage in their own magnificent ways. So I was raised in a house filled with music and culture, and of all types from all over the world. But also both of my parents are great academics. So not only were we performing and making and doing and creating and experiencing, but we were talking about it and reading about it and writing about it and arguing about it too. And so the reflection was always a big part of our household, and that's something I bring to my own work today. Again, great themes of the sense of inheritance, that I'm carrying on the work that my parents very explicitly carried on. My father passed away in 2018. My mother is still alive and well and very productive in her own right, but very much my work is carrying on in their lineage in many ways, musically, culturally, spiritually. And really the theme is bringing ancient wisdom into the contemporary world, sharing this and passing it on, that there's some extraordinary, invisible, ineffable value that is created in the passing on of this wisdom that has been passed on to us. So that's a little overview, the kind of the very high overview of myself and my work. Yeah.
Well, this is a pretty special time of year, Owen. I mean, it's like the great wheel has come around, and you know, I was trying to explain sacred space quickly to a couple of guys who were in charge of a major earthwork in Ohio.
Oh.
And yeah, but they weren't getting, you know, I mean, I assure you I was brief, but I'm going, look, we all know when it's sacred time. We get the solstices, the equinoxes, we get Christmas, we get Halloween, but the world really needs this type of insight. But it's a sacred time, and people can use Halloween not just for going out and getting blasted, which if that's the medicine you need,
there's a bit of that.
Yeah, there's a bit of that.
A bit of the chaos too at this time of year.
It's a bacchanalia.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm going to do this year, but tell us a little bit about contemporary celebration or customs of Halloween in Ireland, and tell us what the Gaelic name is too.
Yes, well, so the Gaelic name this time of year in the Gaelic, the Celtic traditions, is called Samhain. Samhain is how we pronounce it in the Irish language, the Old Irish Gaelic, and that's spelled Samhain in the Irish Gaelic. So many contemporary people will pronounce it Samhain, but we grew up calling it Samhain. And what I love to start talking about these types of things by talking about our own contemporary culture, you know. And today, one of the great tragedies of our modern world is this sense of the tyranny of the present, that we believe that the past is something that's so distant and foreign and exotic. History existed somewhere else, at some time, and it has nothing to do with our contemporary world. And I think everyone can understand that ideology, even great students of history, you know, like yourself. We can be reading this and yet forget that our father, our father's father, our father's father's father, our father's 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 mother lived through the American Civil War. Now, that's as real as me clapping my hands, you know? But we can talk about the American Civil War today as if it actually never even happened, as if it was some kind of Netflix series, you know? And I know that that's the sense. I mean, I feel that myself, even though I'm from a culture, the Celtic culture. It's there's a great friend of mine that I work with, and he says the thing about the past in Ireland is that it's not the past. And there is a sense in indigenous cultures that there's this fluidity between the past and the present, and the future too, you know. But for some reason in our society, we've become so blinkered, and we fetishize the present in such a way as if that the past never existed at all. And I say that because um, Halloween, our celebration of Halloween today, nobody knows that it came from Celtic Europe. And even though here in America, where I make my home here in Western New York, in the village of East Aurora, where you're a neighbor of mine, um, the Americans celebrate Halloween in the perfect Celtic way. I mean, it's an absolute Celtic eruption, and the Americans even do it better in that Halloween, which is the 1st of November, and it's actually the evening of the end, you know, of October into November. Halloween is actually the beginning of Samhain Tide, which is a 6-week period that goes up until Advent. And this 6-week period, the Americans do it perfectly because you have Halloween and you go crazy for it in America. Then you have Thanksgiving in between it, and then Christmas begins. So in America, you guys celebrate this whole festival, the holiday season, you call it over here. And here in America, you say happy holidays, which means anything from Thanksgiving all the way to Christmas or New Year's even. And that's how the Celts celebrated this time of year. This was the most important time of year. Samhain, the Celtic calendar, of course, was divided into two halves: the bright half from the 1st of May and the bright 6 months until the end of August, the 1st of November, and then the dark half of the year. And so the Celtic imagination can be viewed in that interplay between those opposites, the visible world of daylight and the invisible world of darkness. So what's happening on November 1st is that the bright is going down into the dark, a light is disappearing, and the darkness is enveloping. And the hallmark of this time of year is, I think of the image of the ocean crashing up against a cliff. One element is meeting another. And at this time of year, these elements don't meet gently. They meet with an eruption. And the divine erupts, it breaks, it bursts through our visible matrix. And the fabric of our sensible world is broken. And the invisible breaks through, it punches into our consciousness. And it happens a little violently. You know, it's not an easy time of year, actually. And that's very much mirrored in the changing of the seasons. Here, of course, this is a Northern Hemisphere tradition. I always like to pay respects to our companions in the Southern Hemisphere, where the exact opposite is happening too. We must always remember,
Right.
I think that's a great lesson. No matter where you are in the world, someone's experiencing the exact opposite experience at the exact same time, you know. So it's very important to be mindful that as we see our leaves falling in the Southern Hemisphere, they're beginning. But at this time of year, we see the visible world, the beautiful world of our leaves are disappearing, you know. And isn't it such a lesson that the last gasp of our deciduous life puts on this extraordinary Wagnerian symphony of color just before it lets go, you know? It's almost like its crowning moment of the leaf's life is at its last week in the world. And so there's a great lesson in that. And of course, in a week's time, I'll look at this window and all I'll see is the gray, you know, of the trees, and all that color will be gone. So that's what's happening at this time of year in the natural world. A great letting go is occurring. And all that was visible in our gardens is starting to drop down and die and head back into the darkness of the earth from where it came. So you'll find at this time of year, people paying their respects to the invisible world. And the invisible world, of course, a great hallmark of the invisible world is where we go when we are no longer seen, where we go after our mortal bodies have died. We go underground. and we go into the invisible world. Our spirit goes into the next life. So this time of year is dedicated very much to the dead as well. And that's something as well, specifically in contemporary American culture, that I've recognized is a great taboo around death and dying that is very foreign to the Irish imagination. So in Ireland, we love a good funeral. There's nothing that brings the community and the family together like a funeral. And we do in Ireland, what we do is a wake. And the wake is where the body is brought into the home and it'll be placed in the living room. And the community and the family and friends from all around the country, people will drive for hours to come and visit the family with the body in the home. And I heard a statistic recently that even 50% of Irish funerals are still waked. And that'd be my experience too, even, you know, when I was living there in Ireland. And we did the same with my father when he passed away in 2018. And it's an extraordinary experience where the body is there in the house, you know, and it can be there for a day, sometimes 3 days, you know, 2 nights even. Mm. And the body is there and you come to a sense of peace, a certain type of grief is released, and it's released in community with the body present. And if you feel there's any unfinished business, you know, your body is just worked out emotionally and you're wrung out, your tears are wrung out of you, and you've done it in public, in community with the body there. And really such things are put to rest, which I think it's much more difficult to do when that ritual has not occurred, you know. And there's a peace about it. Yeah. So that's one of the things at this time of year is paying respects to the dead. And so in Ireland, and I even remember this, you know, whispered about my grandmother would even talk about what you do on the eve, on Halloween, Hallow evening. Halloween is holy night, holy evening, Hallow even. And on Halloween, you'd light a big fire. You'd stop before you went to bed. You'd stuff the fire roaring, leave a little drink out, leave the door unlocked. And it was said that the dead of the family would come in that night and spend a bit of time in the living room of their home, you know. And just that thought in the culture, I think it really, there can be such a sense of grief and loss and lack around death in this culture. And I think it doesn't need it to be feared in the way that it is feared. And we can have this relationship with the dead, which is so tender and so present and so beautiful, that washes away those senses of loss or alienation or loneliness that death can cause in our life. We can actually befriend the dead at this time of year. And that's a very important thing, because trick or treat, you see, if you don't befriend the dead, if you befriend the dead, you'll get a treat. If you don't befriend the dead, they'll come knocking at the door, you know, and they'll come disturbing you. So this is the time where you must open the door to the strangers, the scary, masked, weird creatures that appear at your door. You must open your door and you must welcome them. You must give them a gift, actually. You must sacrifice something to the dead that come knocking at your door. And if you don't, if you shut your door and shut your curtains and try to block out the other world, they'll come and they'll throw an egg at your house, you see. So that's really the main thing, is the changing into darkness, the honoring of the dead and the invisible world, the giving of sacrifice to that world, the opening your door, welcoming, being hospitable to the darkness. And yeah, I would say those are the main hallmarks, the main sort of teachings that this time of year has to give us.
Fantastic. You know, you talked a little bit about time and the concept that the past is still with us. Tell me if I'm off base, but from reading some of the old literature, I've sort of gotten the feeling that the Druidic concept of time was that it's still happening. Everything that has happened is still happening. Everything that will happen is happening now. And it's not like time is something that inflexibly passes us by. It's like a river. And if you're skilled enough with your, you know, your magic or whatever you want to say, you can take different places along the river and see the future or the past. Would you say that's anything close to?
Isn't that fascinating? And of course, today, I mean, I'm no scientist or quantum physicist. I only know the kind of popular stuff that erupts into popular culture. And you have this idea in quantum physics of time being questionable, you know, that our druid scientists are starting to question the concepts of time and of dimensionality today. And there's definitely something there. I mean, the idea of this very linear chronological time is actually a very new concept. Before our clocks were invented, time was measured by the passing of, by the turning of the stars and the bodies, by the sun passing through the sky. And if you are setting your clock by the sun, you realize very quickly how complex time is, because the sun today is not where the sun was yesterday. So the planets are, the whole world is constantly in this very, very complex motion. And our clocks deny or isolate, insulate us from the complexity of time and of motion. As you're saying, the river, the image of the river, which is far more accurate, that really the nature of reality is like an ocean, a tidal ocean. But the idea of our clock is this very, very abstract, calcified sort of very brittle and very simplistic, superficial type of abstract of what time is, of the reality of being. And so time is seasonal. Time is, and we know ourselves, sometimes an hour can go in a minute, and sometimes a minute can go by in an hour. And when someone is in a very dangerous moment, their whole life can flash before their eyes in half a second. And so we know this, that our experience when it comes to time is very perceptive. Our sense of perception is very important with time. And so the way that we mark time in our culture, the clock, is one way of marking time. But the perception of that is a very, very much more complex thing. And then the reality of natural time, of the universe unfolding. I mean, that's a very, very different type of thing to the clock ticking. And when you analyze what clocks do these days too, it's fascinating. You know, whether it's gears in an old pocket watch, or today, I mean, how are our clocks and our computers running? You know, there's like little sparks running out of crystals or something. It's very, very complex. But yet, time seasonally keeps changing, it keeps pulsating with seasons too. So the Druids, the Celts, unfortunately, they left nothing written down. That's the most infuriating thing about the Celts. They left nothing written down. And yet that's one of the most brilliant hallmarks and teachings, I think, of them. They very deliberately didn't write things down because they believed that when you wrote something down, you did a disservice to the wisdom of the teaching. And that if the teaching was not passed on orally, then it was not meant to be passed on. You were not worthy of it. You had to be able to listen, to memorize, and to recite. And I know, have you ever tried to learn a poem off by heart, you know, or a
Lots of
song?
them. I have.
And it's not easy. It's hard work. You've got to put in this work, but when you do, you kind of have that poem forever, don't you? It's there forever. And when you recite it, every time you recite it, something new will pop out.
Yeah.
Some word will pop out. Now, if you were to read that poem, you lose all of that. You lose all of the hard work. You lose holding it within you, in your memory, in your heart. We say to learn it by heart. So you hold the poem in your heart. And actually, when you learn something off by heart, it changes you. It actually gets into your perception of consciousness, and the world that you perceive is changed forever. So that's one little element of how the Celts believed that wisdom should be transmitted. And imagine if everything we read, Mason, we had to learn off. Imagine how are the superpowers we'd have.
Oh yeah.
I
You know,
believe that's
memory is a very underused talent in our world. And I find myself, I mean, I'm one of the people who grew up reading books, and all of a sudden, as an adult, we've got this digital explosion, and
It's amazing.
it's having some effect on my consciousness. I try to fight it, but hey, before we
right.
get off track, so I'm gathering that the Irish celebration and Scottish is not as dramatic as the celebration in the United States.
Well, over here, it just became kind of magnified and commercialized too.
Oh
You see.
yes, the second biggest commercial holiday of the year. I've always thought that we in the West, we've got kind of a dark side that we need to let out, and
Yes,
we need to
that's
and
right.
we feel like we've got to keep a lot of this bottled up.
That's
And
right.
Halloween is a sanctioned collective catharsis.
I couldn't agree more. I really get that sense when I see it, you know. And here, our village is extraordinary for it. I mean, it's really it's really famous, this Easter Aurora village, and
Love
neighbors.
Halloween.
Oh, they put out the most gruesome, grotesque, you know, these beautiful people who are, you know, mowing their lawns and tending their gardens all year, the most polite and nice people. And then you turn around and you look back, and suddenly the house is filled with blood and guts and gore, and there's
Giant
werewolves and
spiders.
spiders, and
Yeah.
it does feel like there's something that is that is released at this time of year. But and that's the ancient thing. Like I was just when I was waiting for a call, I pulled a few books off the shelf, and this is a great book, In Search of the Awesome Mystery, the lore of megalithic Celtic and Christian Ireland, by a
Oh wow.
great old friend of my mother's. He's passed over now, Sean O'Din. And Sean O'Din, his name is spelled Sean, Sean, the Irish spelling, O'Din, Duinn, Sean O'Din. And the book's called In Search of the Awesome Mystery. And Sean was a monk in Glenstall Abbey that both my parents have been involved with over their lives. And Sean was a great expert, not on Celtic spirituality, Mason, but on pre-Celtic spirituality, because the Celts were newcomers in Ireland, as you well know.
Indeed they were. Yeah, I should have read that before I wrote my recent book, which it's a sequel to the book on the wizard, the Prince of the Air. It'll be out within weeks.
I'm a great believer that once you've read enough, there's no stopping you. You are the holder of enough wisdom, because so much of it is conjecture, Mason, you know.
Oh, yeah.
And so much of it is conjecture. I mean, what do we have? We have the archaeological record, the stones that you can touch. We have the folklore that was written. Some of it was written down by the monks, you know, in the early medieval Irish period, 1,000 years ago. The monks in Ireland wrote down this ancient Celtic lore that was only passed on by word of mouth, and the monks wrote it down. And we have it from the monks. But of course, the monks, they had their agenda and their worldview and their ideology. So they infused all of this Celtic stuff with their Christian ideology. And then we have hundreds and hundreds of years then from then on of us interpreting what was going on back then. And so I think that once you've read enough, you're ready to go. And then your opinion is you're now part of the lineage. And there's no such thing. There's no such thing as someone who knows who the Celts were. If you find someone who tells you who they know what they're talking about, you know instantly.
No, they don't.
You know instantly you're talking with someone who doesn't actually realize, or they do realize, but they want to seem more important than they are. And really, you just have generation after generation of people talking about something that we have a very tenuous, imaginative relationship with. And so I believe that what the Celts have always been in Western culture, Western European culture, the word Keltoi, of course, comes from, there was the Greeks came up with that word. And that basically means someone, the barbarian, someone beyond the walls, someone uncivilized. The Greeks called them Keltoi. And then the Latins, the ancient Romans called the Celts Scoti. Scoti, the Scot, and our word Scot comes from that. Also, our word scholar comes from that, because these Scoti were very, very learned people. The ancient Romans recognized and honored this extraordinary learning, this wisdom that was a hallmark of these cultures in the north, you know. And so the Celts were these people in the imagination of Western Europe that were beyond civilized behavior. Yeah. So we have our civilized visible world of the rational, the reason, you know, our mind. And of course, the great Western inheritance is around, you know, the science of mind is one of the great hallmarks of Western culture. And the Celts represented those that were beyond that, and in a way, the culture of the imagination. And so my reading of the Celts is that over the millennia and the centuries, the Celts have inhabited that place of the Western mind that is beyond the rational, beyond the visible, beyond the knowing. And I think even up to this day, that's what they represent in our Western mind. The Celts are something that we are not. They are beyond our visible world. And I think it's quite accurate, because from the archaeological record, from the folkloric, the mythological record, I think they were really into shape shifting and imagination and mystery. And I mean, even the fact that they didn't write stuff down, and they prided themselves on the aspect of that culture. That kind of tells you that they were a culture that prized the imagination as opposed to the visible literate word, you know?
Oh, you look at the unique art, Celtic iconography, you look at the legacy of poets and writers and singers and musicians that have come out of Celtic tradition. You look at the impact of Ireland with its small population on literature. It's
very unusual.
And you know, Europe always considered the Celts to be sort of the Native Americans of Europe. I mean, the way we stereotype Native Americans now is all being mystical.
Same thing.
And yeah, Europe always did that with the Celts. So
yes. Very similar thing that the the settlers in America did with the Native Americans, or that we do today with the Native Americans, that they are holders of some ancient invisible wisdom that we, these settlers, these imperialists, we can never access that sense of spirituality. So the Celts seemingly held that. But here's the thing, you know, like all stereotypes, you know, that there's an element of truth in all stereotypes, you know. And I think the Celts did actually have this connection. And as you say, it carries on to this day, especially in Ireland, with the profusion of world-class artistry, which is just mind-blowing, as you say, with such a small population. But when you look at, so Celtic art is an interesting one. And of course, one of the great flowerings of Celtic art was that early Irish monastic period, the early medieval period. And the great visual artistic image from that time was the Book of Kells.
The Book of Kells, the Illuminators.
Kells, Kells. And Kells is a little town outside of Dublin. And there was what these monks in Ireland did as the Roman Empire disintegrated. It is said that Europe was plunged into darkness, the Dark Ages. I think that telling of history is a little bit exaggerated, but of course there's a great truth there too. But so what happened was, Ireland became this repository of that Greek and Roman learning. It retreated to the island of Ireland as this safe haven for this higher learning. And so it was said at one time, there was only one man in the whole world that could speak ancient Greek and Latin. John Scotus Eriugena was the only man in the world who could speak Greek and Latin. One of these old Irish monks, you know, from around the kind of, you're looking a period of this golden age of Irish history, it was called, from around, say, 500 to 1000 AD. And there was this, and again, you can look at the archaeological record. There were hundreds and hundreds of these monasteries that were founded all around Ireland. And the ruins are there today. They're undeniable that there was this extraordinary concentration of activity. And these monasteries were centers of learning. They were basically universities, but also they were the social fabric of the society too, that the abbot was the ruler of the parish as well. So there was a social structure. These monasteries actually ruled or sort of controlled the society. And And so the nobles, the wealthy of Europe would send their children to Ireland to be educated in Greek and Latin. And so one of the things the monasteries did back then, information technology, was the copying of manuscripts. So the monks by hand had to take these books and physically copy the text out. And then those texts were then sent back around the world. So the monks always had these scriptorium where they were copying books all the time. But again, the Celtic imagination sort of overtook the Greek and Roman inheritance there. And the monks started to what's called illuminate the manuscripts. And if you see the Book of Kells, after a few hundred years of this tradition of illumination, the Book of Kells is this psychedelic, like magical mystery tour, sort of hallucinogenic trip. And every page, the detail, it said they would use a single horse's hair to paint some of the detail on the illumination of this manuscript. And you've gold and reds and crimsons and blues and all of these very exotic colors at the time. And again, the monks were at the cutting edge of information technology, of the type of material they would use for the books, the types of ink and pigments. They were using these types of technologies that would last for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, we still have the Book of Kells today, as vivid as ever. But what most people forget is that the Book of Kells is actually a copy of the Gospels, the New Testament, the Christian story out of the Middle East, you know. And if you see a Bible today, for example, you couldn't imagine a more boring looking book than the Bible that we have. I mean, the thin paper, the tiny text, these lines, black and white lines of little squiggles. I mean, it's the most horrific artifact you could imagine. It's just so boring. And the Irish monks took that book and they said, you know what? We're going to tell you, we're going to copy this story word for word, but let me show you what the imagination can do when it really retells this story. And so when you look at the Book of Kells and you hold up, say, you know, I mean, a classic Bible, any old Bible today, and you hold them side by side, I think you couldn't have two more vivid examples of the Western mind and the Celtic mind.
Whoa. Hey, before we, I think a lot of our listeners are deeply appreciative of insight into Celtic spirituality, such as you're providing us, but some of them are really into the ghoulies and the ghosties.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, they want to get right down to the what would you say is the contemporary Irish attitude to something like ghosts and haunted houses? I know it's not the number one feature. We'll get to the number one feature of Celtic mythology soon, but what would you say is the
Yeah.
contemporary attitude to ghosts and haunted houses over there?
Well, contemporary is interesting. I mean, Ireland is a very strange place, and you'll never get a straight answer, you know, from an Irish person. It's one of the Irish people sort of we speak in spirals. Conversations are instantly undermined the moment the question is asked, and to the American imagination, the layers of sarcasm and irony that exist in the simplest utterances from an Irish person, it's quite overwhelming. And but so my mother tells a story. There was an old woman, you know, in the village where she grew up, and she was a bit simple, but so the children would make fun of her, you know. And she's a story of once they went up to her and said, Mary, now do you believe in the fairies? And Mary said, I don't believe in the fairy. Don't be ridiculous. This is stupid. Don't be stupid. Don't be stupid. But they're there all right. And so you'll find that attitude to the invisible world in Ireland today, you know, that if you ask straight on, they'll deny it, but they're there all right, you know. And so there's just a great respect in Ireland for these hollow hills and holy places, as they were called. Like in Ireland, you'll find the highest concentration of stone circles of megalithic art in the world, because the farmers in Ireland would leave these places untouched. And even, you know, modern roadworks would be very sensitive to archaeological places and would divert roads, you know, engineering projects around these ancient sites. Whereas, of course, in Western Europe, North America, that was not there at all. You build the road straight, as straight as you can go, and that's absolutely beautiful. The straighter the road, the more beautiful it is, you know. And so much of the ancient history in North America has been leveled and flattened and over. You know, there's extreme. You know, we have no idea here of the historic and prehistoric cultures that lived and built and constructed, you know, these great civilizations that were up here. But in Ireland, there is this reverence to those places, and it can be seen again in the archaeological record. It has survived. These farmers have not pulled those stones down. They have not cut those trees in those sacred groves to this very day. So you'll find that, first of all, is an unspoken, almost reverence for the invisible world. And there's great folklore and mystery around these old forts, these old stone circles, these old tombs. And it's said, especially around Halloween, around the night of Halloween, that if you walk past these places at night, you will hear and see the fairies dancing and making merry. And you have to be very careful at these times, especially if one of them crosses your path, because they'll trick you. They're very deceptive and deceiving, and you have to have your wits about you, or else they'll bring you back with them into the underworld, and you will never be seen again, you know. So it's a great lesson around our own unconscious, and how the drives, the forces in our unconscious too, can come forth and burst forth and entrap us and capture us and enslave us to habits and addictions and ways of being from which we might never emerge. So all of these stories are there as lessons and as teachings to us, you know. When you talk about a ghost, you're not talking about a ghost at all. You're talking about a part of yourself that's come back to haunt you. And when you talk about a werewolf, if you see a werewolf, or if you see a fairy, if you see a ghost, that's a part of yourself that has erupted into your consciousness, and it's there to tell you something. And the message is probably pretty simple. It's probably pretty simple. And the message is, are you going to outwit this riddle that has emerged? Or are you going to fall prey to it and fall victim to it? Yeah. And so there's great rituals around this time of year. A big part of this is, of course, giving sacrifice, giving something over. So here at this time of year, we had to order 500 little mini candies to give out to all these kids that are going to come around. So the big question is, when something comes knocking at your door, are you going to open the door and be generous and hospitable to it? Or are you going to shut the door to the strange parts of yourself that need to be welcomed? And are you going to just shut yourself off from the world and alienate yourself from the world? And then the world is going to haunt you and continually haunt you until you're good and ready to, until you can't resist anymore. And the world will have its way with you. Yeah. So that's one of the great lessons of this time of year, is that a sacrifice is required, a hospitality, not only a sacrifice, but actually a giving over, a surrendering to the invisible world. And if you don't surrender, and if you try to resist, the invisible world will swallow you up, and you'll be seen no more.
Have you, you've probably heard of the Irish poet Micheál Hartnett?
Yeah, I have. He was from my part of the world. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually met him.
Oh my God.
I met him in Boston when I was a graduate student. He was doing a reading there. Yeah. Delightful man.
Oh,
Delightful.
I never met him. Yeah.
I remember talking to him, you know, because I was a great fan of Yeats, and I remember asking him about the fairies.
Yeah.
And he said he believed in them.
Fascinating.
Yeah. And you know, he was just a beloved figure around Ireland.
That's
and
right.
I think he went to a certain one of 3 Dublin pubs every day at noon. He would be at one of these 3 Dublin pubs, and he would get up at noon like clockwork and recite extempore some lines of poetry. And everybody just loved him, and they'd all fall and they'd quiet each other down.
Amazing.
And apparently there was some scumbag who one day tried to break up the routine by shouting him down, and they were about ready to pound this guy. And Nicole Hartnett goes, no, let him be. But he told me that he believed in the fairies, and I didn't ask him too many specifics, but what would you say is the level of belief in Ireland today in these magical, supernatural races of human-like beings that we would call fairies?
It's a good question. You know, it's a really good question. First of all, I'm shocked that he gave you a straight answer.
I was pretty young then. He probably knew I couldn't handle the subterfuge.
I have a young American man. They're real. How about that? Go home now. Like, I think certainly we just live in such a different world today than the world of a time where it seems as if people saw things that we just do not see today, and they saw them as real as we see the real world today. And I mean, I literally saw a ghost once myself in Ireland. It was a very real experience. And it wasn't just a ghost, it was a poltergeist where the ghost actually opened a door. And then someone else saw that the door was open. No one else opened the door. It was the ghost opened the door, and the door was open. And I definitely saw that, and I was awake, and it was a very mysterious experience. So I certainly have had one experience in my life where I saw the invisible world actually have real agency in the physical world. That was quite inexplicable now. So perhaps some people can see things in ways today that most of us cannot. And perhaps in the past, things could be seen that today most of us cannot see. You know, I do believe culture is very, very fundamental to worldview, and that, you know, we believe that we're abstract from culture and that reason is abstract from culture. But I don't believe that. From my reading of history, from my reading of the history of science is fascinating, you know, because science considers itself so objective. And yet, if you look at the history of science, that's not true. You know, science is not objective. Science changes, and the worldview of science changes depending on social norms and changes in society. So I think that there is an invisible world. Yeah, in the same way as we can only literally see a tiny spectrum of light, we can hear quite a larger spectrum of sound. We can feel a spectrum of touch. We can smell a spectrum of smell. What about all the other spectrums? What about the spectrum of electromagnetism? And what about the spectrums that we're not even aware of? What about the spectrum of rational conception? We can only think within a certain spectrum. Why would our little ant brain be able to think of everything? Our little ant brain is tiny, little things firing, and that's all we can perceive. So that would be my take on it, Mason. And beyond that, I don't know. Does that make sense at all? It's very hard to speak about.
Yeah, I can tell. Well, let's.
I mean, what do you think?
What do I think about the fairies?
Yeah,
well, that's a tough question.
Well, there you go.
I would have to say literal belief in the beings like our folklore, that, you know, that's a tough one. But let's just put it like this. I talk to a lot of people who, they don't say they saw a fairy, but these little, and not all the fairies, as we know of mythology, were little, but at least this supernatural, magical beings that are little human beings. I mean, a lot of the imaginary friends that children have
Yes.
certainly qualify as fairy beings. The First Nations of the Americas, they've all got traditions of little people. I'm not going to tell them they're all crazy. I may tell them I've never seen one myself, and but I didn't ask you whether you believed. I asked you what you thought most of the contemporary Irish thought, and
And I'd say
I
it's pretty nuanced like that. I'd say they're
yeah
pretty nuanced. Yeah, I think there
yeah
is that sense of nuance in Ireland. There's respect. There's a definite, strong cultural respect for that type of way of thinking. Yeah.
we know in Iceland, I think the fairy belief is number one in Iceland. I actually had the privilege of being interviewed for a documentary for Icelandic TV. I've never seen
Right.
the clip. I hope I did okay, but I was interviewed by a guy who was doing a documentary on little people traditions around the world.
Wow.
And he was actually visiting Lilydale, which is near
Ah, yes.
where I live.
Yeah.
And through mutual friends, he had come across the book on the Iroquois supernatural traditions that Mike Bestine, your friend and mine,
Yeah.
wrote together.
Beautiful
And
book.
he actually interviewed me for that and asked me about. It was a very profound interview. It was really interesting. There's whatever you believe about the little people, there is a worldwide pattern of the way people perceive them, and it can't be cultural interchange because it's too old, it's
Yes.
too far back, the parts of the world are too far
Yes.
flung. So there's, if nothing else, there's some kind of a message to the human unconscious in
Yes.
these little people. It's connected with nature, it's
Yes.
connected with the imagination, it's connected with the spirits of the dead, it's connected with children. And Halloween, it's safe to say, is probably the time of the fairies, isn't it?
Absolutely. And again, I personally like my you'll find like so let's say specifically in Ireland. So to go back to that question of like what people in Ireland think, Ireland has this extraordinary culture to this mind of a wild imagination, but with a very realistic skepticism, and those live together. Those two things live together in the Irish imagination. And of course, the history of colonization in Ireland has led to a very kind of withdrawn, objective awareness of power and how power influences and corrupts. And so there is a great skepticism in the Irish imagination, as well as its romantic kind of wildness. So I think you'll find that if you do speak to an Irish person, there will be that sense of great uh, um, an honoring of the mythology, but yet a kind of a skepticism around a lack of a holding back into a full belief. And so you'll find that dynamic specifically in the Irish imagination as well too. I love the like I believe that these stories, these songs that have been inherited and passed on have a medicinal function to them. I believe there's a medicinal function to these stories and mythologies that have been passed down. And of course, when we're talking about the world of the imagination, we're talking about mental health. And
I
these are
oh,
medicine for the health
the
of our
soul,
mind, the health of the
yeah,
soul. And so
and
yeah,
children who are cut off from ancestral wisdom are not, they're not whole.
children and adult. I mean, aren't there amazing? There's amazing medical research now around loneliness and ailments of what's that word of like affluence? Perhaps being the largest killers and causes of illness in our society today. This sense of alienation and loneliness, and how connection and community is so linked to health on so many levels. Sleep as well, too. Sleep is so important. And so I think that these stories have secrets of medicine within them. And so the great story of the fairies in Ireland is about the Celts coming to Ireland, and they find these little people living there. And the Celts, you see, were newcomers to Ireland. There was millennia of history in Ireland before the Celts arrived. So the Celts represented, actually, at the time, this Western European. They were a very vigorous, very warlike, a science. They were big into metals and metal making, you know, so they were scientists. They were very warlike, the Celts. Actually, they were great warriors, and they had chariots, you know, which were big pieces of technology. And of course, people forget, if you have a chariot, you also have to have a road system, a road network. So people think about the Celts going around in their chariots, but they don't really think about the roads that were required to carry these chariots around Western Europe. So the Celts were making roads. They were riding out on their chariots. They had great armies. And again, metalwork, they were at the forefront of metallurgy and the science, the technology of metalworking. So they arrive into Ireland and they find these little people who were a very peaceful, artistic, and magical people. They had great magic about them. And the Celts came to Ireland, and they were in full battle formation, about to conquer Ireland against these little people. They were referred to as the Tua de Donnan, the people of the god of Donnan, of Danu, the god Danu, which is a pre-Celtic, an ancient, really old god. And so as the Celts were about to conquer and vanquish the Tua de Donnan with their mighty army, it's said that the Tua de Donnan, they turned sideways into the light and disappeared. And the Tua de Donnan went underground, and they retreated underground. And every year they would pull the harvest underneath the earth from the Celts. And the Celts eventually, so the Tua de Donnan would subvert, they would subterfuge the visible world of the Celts, you see. And so the king of the Celts had to go to the king of the Tua de Donnan and said, listen, we have to negotiate. What are we going to do? Because we have no harvest. You're pulling the harvest down into the underworld. And the king of the Tua de Donnan said, right, we will leave your harvest alone, but you must respect the hollow hills and the holy places. You must respect the hollow hills and the holy places. So that's the deal. That's the deal between the world of the invisible world within ourselves and the visible world of our harvest that we need to sustain ourselves. We must respect the hollow hills and the holy places of our invisible world. And if we do damage to those hollow hills and holy places, boom, they're going to steal our harvest, and we're going to be left famished, poor, lonely, haunted. We'll be shells of ourselves until we're ready on our knees to do that deal with the invisible world within us. Yeah.
Boy, I think that's going on right now. You know, you've given us a pretty good formula for contemporary society. Hey,
absolutely.
Have you ever come across the Yeats cycle of stories called The Stories of Red Hanrahan?
No,
Red Hanrahan.
No, I've not got into it. No,
it's not a very long book, but it's this set of metaphorical tales. There's 6 of them about the proverbial stereotypical Irish bard. It's probably set in the late 1700s, and I may have a copy of the Hanrahan Tales around. I'd recommend you give those a read, because it's just the figure of the bard.
What did you get out of it? Tell us. Yeah, what was its teaching, would you say, its wisdom?
Oh, well, for one thing, it was written in a very archaic style that I, as a young man, fell so in love with that I started copying it. And you really, it's a big risk in your prose when you try to copy another writer's archaic style. But I would say, for one thing, the Grail, you know, the Grail cycle, the Grail treasures, a lot of mythology was woven into it, and a lot of the imagery and atmosphere of the countryside and the life of this sincere artist dedicated to his craft. And I just found myself obsessed with those cycles. I wanted to, if I ever thought I could do it, I would love to rewrite something like those for Western New York, you know, the evoking the countryside. And I'm on to other things. I don't think I can do that. But Well, I wanted to ask you one or two more things before we
Sure.
part.
Lovely.
I've got a list. What about the ley lines? I know Ireland has them just like England. Are you aware of any traditions of supernaturalism concerning the ley lines in Ireland?
Well, yeah, uh, absolutely. There's what like one of the things that's fascinating about I said like Ireland has the highest density of these stone circles um of anywhere, and that was a megalithic or a neolithic culture. So this is long before the Celts came. There was this culture that was in Ireland. It was in Western Europe, because the archaeology, we can see it's similar, in like Scandinavia down to the Iberian Peninsula. These stone circles, these megalithic tombs. But in Ireland, they're littered. The country is littered with these, especially the southwest in particular. And the region where I'm from has the largest stone circle in the world. This Neolithic stone circle. It's called Grange Stone Circle near Lochgar. And but there's one stone circle down the southwest called Bonawn Stone Circle. It's a small one. It's not big. It's small. But a local folklorist and historian and archaeologist has done this amazing research. And what they've done is they have lined up these stones with different astronomical phenomenon during the year, including these huge lunar cycles of 21 years or something, where the moon will appear at a certain place at a certain time, and the full moon will roll up a hill in the distance. And eventually there was built a kind of a column on top of the hill, and the full moon would sit on top of this column. And what this guy did was he followed these stones all the way out and all along from the stone out to the furthest horizon where the star or the planet or the moon would hover. He would find these monuments, these other stones or even churches that were built along these lines. And so when you're in the middle of the stone circle and you're looking out at the stone, marking something on the horizon, there's actually this straight line that goes from the stone out to the astronomical occurrence. And they used to mark these lines out. And so when I think of those ideas of ley lines or power lines, I often think of that stone circle, that Bonawn stone circle, where the person standing at the center of that circle, and it was that old cosmology we used to have too in Europe of the human being at the center of the universe, and the whole universe was actually in harmony around the individual. And so our soul, that we were the center of the world, and each line is like a spoke in a wheel, and we're the hub of that wheel. And I think that was an ancient view. And of course, today that we live in the polar opposite of that today, where we're just a speck of dust flying in a cosmic, infinite, universal speck of dust flying in the corner of some huge speck of dust. You couldn't find a more alienated and isolated concept of the human being than our contemporary cosmology, where we talk about that there was once a big bang and now we're just a tiny speck of dust in an infinite amount of galaxies. Whereas the ancient way was that, no, you are the sovereign human soul of the universe, and the entire universe is revolving around you right now. And I find that to be such a heartening, beautiful way of looking at the world. Because if you go back to our perception, the sun is moving around us right now. The stars are circling me right now. The whole world is unfolding itself to my senses. I mean, that's how the world actually is to me. I am the center of the world. Mason, you are the center of the world. And each one of the listeners, you are the center of the universe. And that means you are a sovereign, beautiful, infinite soul, And I just find that so interesting. So when I think of ley lines, I don't see them as external. I see the ley line as the relationship of the physical world to my inner soul. And then there's other traditions where people are out there and they're mapping all of these ancient sites. And there are some very, very unusual lines of ancient sacred sites around the world. I'm not an expert in those. I always look for the personal turn in all of these. Like, what is the teaching that the ley line has to give me, rather than me going out to the ley line saying, what physical phenomenon can I harness or exploit? I like to see the world in a different way, where it's like, here's a ley line. What's that ley line within me, and what does that sort of say within me? But having said that, now Ireland is littered with these ancient sites. They're all over the place, and then there are also pilgrim paths too, and these paths would extend all over Europe, and you would start on a pilgrim path in Ireland, and it would take you. There was people who visit Ireland, and they go and visit the Guinness factory in Dublin. The Guinness factory in Dublin is at a place called St. James's Gate. And it's called St. James's Gate because that's where the pilgrims would go to begin the Camino de Santiago. And Santiago is the Spanish, Iago is this name of James. And so the pilgrims would go to St. James's Gate in Dublin to start on the pilgrim path that would take them along the route of northern Spain. And so you have this idea, and they say too, like, that all of our ancient roadways were actually following the routes that animals would have taken and worn away. And that there are these natural ways that geography encourages us to move in. And so I think that the world is filled with these natural ancient paths that it's very nourishing when we re-engage with those ancient ways of moving in the world. And I think the reasons why those ancient ways are so nourishing for us, I think it's very mysterious. And I don't think our science has caught up yet to the extraordinary complexity and sophistication that the mechanism whereby we get a sense of rightness when we're on these ancient paths. Yeah.
Oh, when you are a marvelous scholar and teacher and thinker, I hope we can have you back on here someday soon.
Great. Yeah, we'd love it. And Mason, yeah, as the great Massachusetts mystic Emily Dickinson would say, Mason, the soul selects her own society and shuts the door. So thank you very much for inviting me here. And anyone who's listening to this, your soul has selected this society and you're in the right place. And so thank you, Mason, for the invitation.
Thanks for being part of the work of the light. I'll see you right soon, old friend.
Lovely. And happy Halloween. Yeah, all the blessings of Samhain to you. Yeah.